Professor Gordon Noble. It's a great honour to speak to you. I've been following your work for a number of years now. You are Professor of Archaeology at Aberdeen University, where there's all sorts of incredible developments going on to do with the Picts up in northern Scotland. You're the author of this fantastic book from a number of years ago, The Picts, Scourge of Rome, Rulers of the North, for people who are just listening. There's been a lot of developments in Pictland over the last few years. In 1955, archaeologist F.T. Wainwright wrote an influential book, which you're probably aware of, called The Problem of the Picts. Popularly, I think probably still now, the Picts are seen as kind of a people apart, a mysterious people who, the problem, the riddle of the Picts, the mystery of the Picts. Have you solved the riddle of the Picts?
Absolutely not. No, that's what I
Damn.
No, hopefully we've taken away some of the mystery, and they'll just more intriguing than mysterious now. But certainly there are still huge amounts of work to do, really. But we have made very significant progress in the last few decades, really. Not just our project, but other people working on this time period. So it's a really, really exciting time, I think, to be part of picture studies. So it's a real privilege to work on some of these important sites like Rhynie and Burghead, which we'll talk about today. And it's a real surprise, because when I was first thinking about doing Pictish archaeology, people said, don't do that. That's crazy. You'll just get lost in the world of the Pictish symbols, and nobody knows what they're about, and there's nothing to find really in the ground. So it actually took me quite a few years to actually start working on the Picts, because I got waylaid into prehistory and the like, because I kind of fell into that trap of thinking, because there wasn't an awful lot known, that we couldn't really advance on that. So it's been really exciting to see what's came out in the last few years, really.
So, I mean, the biggest development that I have seen, anyway, the really exciting one is Tap Noth. I mean, I may be butchering the pronunciation there, but it's a massive fort. I mean, could you tell us a little bit about that? Were you leading the digs there?
Myself and colleagues. Yes, so we started, the first ever project that I actually did on the Picts with Megan Gondek at Chester. Worked on Rhynie, which is just in the lowlands down below Tap Noth, which is this huge hill fort. And to cut a long story short, we think we've got a early royal site of the Picts there. The place name means a royal place, or a place associated with a sacred king, something along those lines. With the early Celtic word "re" for king being in that place name. And we found this settlement site that had been identified by aerial photographs in the 1970s, so decades before, but never investigated. We uncovered, large buildings, enclosures, pottery that was coming from the Eastern Mediterranean, these big storage amphora, probably for Mediterranean wine. You find glass coming from Western France. All in this, what is now a tiny, tiny village in rural Aberdeenshire in northeast Scotland. So it seems to be this really important central place emerging in the kind of late Roman period, and seems to go out of use in the 6th or 7th century AD. And then just above that place is this amazing hill fort, Tap Noth, which is about 16, 17 hectares in extent. And again, this was known about previously, but apart from some Victorian excavations, had never actually been excavated. And we kind of fell in with traditional wisdom, which said this was going to be, late Bronze Age or early Iron Age, when the climate was better and you could live on top of these crazy hills, because it's about 550 meters high, this hill fort. And one of my colleagues, James O'Driscoll, did some drone survey there, and we had some LiDAR survey as well. And we put all that together, and we identified about 800 house platforms on this hill. So just giant communities.
It's a lot.
On there. It's a lot. And then we did some excavations on this rampart, which encloses about 17 hectares. Huge area. I think it's the second largest hill fort known in northern Britain, not just Scotland. And we got the surprise of our lives, really, when we got the radiocarbon dates back, which were 3rd century AD through to 7th century AD. So exactly contemporary with the really important settlement of Rhynie down below. And again, spanning this kind of late Roman period when the Picts are first mentioned in Roman sources, through to about the 7th century when we know there's this important overkingship of the Picts for true emerging in that time period. So it was really, really surprising results and really super exciting. Which we got our radiocarbon date results just before that first COVID lockdown hit. So we were stuck in the office going, "Oh my god, this is amazing! Oh my god, we can't do anything about it."
No, nightmare, nightmare. I mean, just for context, I mean, could you just describe most Pictish forts for us? Because they're a lot smaller, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, we only have a handful really known, but generally, early medieval power centers were, and still are to an extent, characterized by these, kind of more kind of citadel, nuclear hill forts, multiple enclosures, but really quite small, a hectare, couple of hectares. So this is, 17 hectares,
17 times larger.
17 times larger than some of these sites. I can't remember how many football pitches that is, but it's a lot.
It's a few. It's a few. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I've been there myself, and it's a really impressive place. And
It is, yeah, yeah.
you're walking around, and it's astounding to think that it's early medieval rather than Iron Age.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, even for it to be Iron Age would have been surprising, that scale, really.
Yeah, yeah.
And other than that, the other uh, large fort of that time period was Burghead, which is this promontory fort that we're working on now. And that's about 5 hectares or so. But most of that's taken up by the ramparts. So it's a much, much smaller site, still very significant for the time period. But yeah, it just absolutely blew any um, preconceived notions of this time period, the Dark Ages being, small scale societies, not having large sites, having a real absence of settlement from the Pictish period, and suddenly we have a site that has 800 houses on it, with 800 floors and hearths and structural remains on there. It's just incredible. And I think we dug, I don't know, I can't remember now, 16, 18 houses. So it's still a tiny sample. But there's a site there that you could dig for the rest of your career and then some. So it's super exciting to begin to put some of these picture sites on the map and be able to say there's still a lot more we could find out about these sites.
Absolutely. I mean, so it's a royal centre. You think? Which kingdom?
So we've just got a monograph out for Rhynie. It's open access, it's online, published by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And I'm referencing that because it's quite a long, complex story to begin to piece together, what kingdom this might have been part of. And the real short answer is we simply don't know. I mean, this,
Yeah.
we don't know a lot about the Picts in terms of the historical sources, but we particularly don't know a lot about the Picts in this kind of late Roman to, kind of mid 600s AD, because most of our sources really only come online in the 7th, 8th centuries.
Yeah.
And even then, it's hard to actually pin down where are these kingdoms. Are there multiple kings all through the Pictish period, or is there one over king? So we really don't know. It might have been part of Fortru, which becomes the over kingdom of the Picts, but it might also be part of a region known as Kay in the later Pictish sources. Um, so it's kind of frustrating still that we can't really put names of polities to some of these areas. But what is exciting is that archaeology is beginning to reveal the material traces of these leaders and of these societies that we just simply had no clue how complex they were, how large some of their sites were. Um, and yeah, modern archaeology is really, really beginning to change the story on the Picts, which is exciting.
It exists only in archaeology a lot of the time. There's no historical sources, which is just it's crazy, isn't it?
That's right.
What about Burghead?
Yes. So yeah, we were really, well, I personally was thinking, right, that's it. I've reached career pinnacle. It's just going to be downhill from here. But we started working on Burghead, and we got this bigger umbrella project called Northern Picts, which you can follow us on Facebook and Blue Sky and other places.
Put a link to it down below.
That'd be cool. Thanks, Pete. And so we've always taken quite a broad scale approach to finding other sites, because you can go and dig 10 hill forts and maybe one of them might have Pictish phases, and settlement sites are well, apart from Tap and Noth, are still quite difficult to find. So you have to do lots of kind of surveys and excavations of other sites. And we'd done a bit of work in Burghead in 2015. And again, people were like, "Oh no, don't bother working on that site because it's all been trashed." So it's this big promontory fort that sticks out into the Moray Firth, so kind of between Inverness and Aberdeen, so the Moray Firth coast. And it's this really impressive promontory fort, huge ramparts, 8 meters across, 6 meters high. So altogether, different scale of defences to somewhere like Tapanoth or Rhynie. But the problem was that the modern town of Burghead was built over the remains of the fort and probably trashed around about 50% of the site. And there was a perception that even the surviving bits were really compromised. And we dug in an area that was not scheduled, so not protected by Historic Environment Scotland, because it was someone's garden. This guy, Edward, who lives in Burghead, the Coast Guard station houses, which are towards the end of the promontory.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, a part of the upper fort was survived in his garden, and he allowed us to come and dig some test bits in his garden, which was
Good man. Good man.
And then we got a big JCB in, and he was like, "Oh my god!"
Destroy his house.
And that was amazing, because I think it was like, probably our second test bit. We came down the floor of this 9th century building.
Wow.
With a coin of King Alfred, the famous Anglo.
Wow. Yeah.
In the floor layer, part of a sword, nice floor deposits, loads of animal bone, outline of a house, which again, in a kind of lowland context, very, very unusual to be able to find Pictish dwellings, because most have just been ploughed away. So again, we were like, "Oh my goodness, there is actually stuff here." And so over the next few years, we did fairly small scale stuff in Edward's garden, and then we got a bit of money behind the project through the Leverhulme Trust and Historic Environment Scotland, and began to investigate other parts of the site, and realised that that it has been compromised in certain areas, but in other areas it's an incredibly well preserved site, not because it's a upland hill fort like Tapanoth, but because it's this coastal site. And over the years you've had lots of sand below covering over these quite fragile house floors. And so there can be up to under a meter of overburden, but are really well preserved once you get down to them. So again, we've kind of landed on our feet, and we've got this incredibly well preserved site, but of this kind of later Pictish period, so 7th century through to the kind of 9th or early 10th century, into that Viking age when the Picts disappear. So it's just absolutely ideal. We now have this great case study where we can show the development of what must be another kind of royal or major centre in this later Pictish period, and what happens to it in the Viking Age when that Pictish identity disappears. And again, to cut a long story short, it seems to be destroyed around about 900 AD, and really comes to an end round about the same time this Pictish identity disappears from our written sources. So again, we've got amazing opportunities to try and tie together our limited historical and literary evidence to this amazing archaeological sequence. So we're super excited about Burghead as well, and I think it's going to be an equally exciting story to what we had at Rhynie and Tapanoth.
The Burghead bulls in particular are absolutely magnificent. I bet you were hoping for something like that, weren't you?
Yeah, I mean, despite all the years being working on Pictish sites, we found one Pictish stone which wasn't really in context, Aberlemno. So no, unfortunately, archaeologists don't often find actual Pictish stones in context, usually because farmers have came along, decades prior and plowed them all up because they're big stones lying in the middle of their field.
Yeah,
But you never know. We've still
you
got
never know.
1, maybe 2 years left of Burghead, so we might find something like that. But, the finds, aside from a Burghead bull, have been astounding. We've got, kinda early medieval bells, we've got weaponry, we've got beautiful bone pins and bone combs of the types you don't normally get preserved on mainland Scotland. We've got bits of what might be, kinda book covers, all sorts of personal adornments. So again, it's just amazing what's actually still under the ground there at Burghead, despite this kind of process of destruction through the building of the modern town. So yeah, it's really, really exciting to see what's going to turn up at Burghead.
You say book covers. That I find that very interesting. I mean, that's linked to Christianity.
Absolutely. So yeah, the Picts are definitely, largely Christian by the 7th century. So yeah, Burghead, we've got objects like bone objects decorated with cross designs. We've got this beautiful bronze and garnet or glass finger ring that's got kind of cruciform designs. Um, and we've also, from the earlier discoveries, there's a whole series of early Christian cross slab fragments and parts of shrines and the like. So yeah, definitely a Christian community. There's probably a church within the fort, judging by the sculpture. Um, so yeah, again, that's really exciting in terms of the bulls might be part of the early story of the fort, but we certainly have a Christian community there in the latter stages of that site. So that's really again exciting to see that transition in society and how these central places become aligned with the church, and you begin to get royal patronage at some of these major church centres in the same period that Burghead's really taking off.
So the Burghead bulls seem a bit pagan to me. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And then also, Rhynie Man is a very interesting thing because I mean that is a. I
Yeah.
mean, I've heard it described as a pagan god, even a named pagan god. I can't remember what the name is now, but yeah. At what point, do the Picts become Christian, and is it becoming Christian on their own terms?
Ooh, yeah. Well, that's a good question.
Big question.
Good question. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think, Rhynie in its early stages, certainly in that kind of 3rd, 4th, 5th, early 6th century, seems to me like a pagan center. And we argue in the monograph that Rhynie Man is probably a deity or a god of some kind, and one probably associated with kingship rituals. So one interpretation of the axe is that it's like the son who ship burial axe. It's associated with poleaxing animals and cattle as part of kind of feasting rituals and kingship rituals in this pagan time period. Um, and then there's things like there's a warrior figure from Rhynie as well, but we don't really know much about what pagan Pictish beliefs would have been about. There's a few references and things like the life of Columba to, holy wells and kind of natural places in the landscape, but not an awful lot of detail on that. As you can imagine, it's not something they
Yeah,
particularly probably want to promote. But certainly, our written sources would suggest that the Picts are you know, fully converted, certainly at the elite level by the 7th century. And the early churches that we get, or not necessarily churches, but enclosures and sculpture and the like, would be probably, kind of later 6th, 7th century end date. So that seems to be when the big transition happens. But obviously, these kind of traditional beliefs may well have continued at a lower level in the society, a level in society that's not visible in our written sources. But archaeology might help illuminate that element. So it's something that myself and Nick Evans has been writing about recently, and it's really fascinating to begin to piece together those glimmers of this pre-Christian religion within Pictland. And that's one of the amazing things about the Picts is all their carvings and the kind of illumination of society that gives, unlike many other regions in Britain and Ireland this time period. the sculptural assemblage is so amazing and gives such insight into belief, everyday life, kind of elite pursuits like hunting, warrior scenes and the like. So yeah, that's why myself and I think many people got into the Picts is because of this amazing art that they have that you see in the Burghead bulls, the Rhynie man, and the like. And they're such amazing carvers. Um, that it's just so arresting, and you want to know more about the context of this art and the symbol system and the like. So that's why I got into it, and that's why people warned me off, saying, you'll never crack the code. And we probably won't, but we can certainly tell a lot more about the archaeological context of these carvings. Rhynie Man, for example, we think we identified the socket for him. He was found during ploughing in the 1970s, and it's right at the entranceway to this, kind of elite complex at Rhynie. So you probably would have passed by this sculpture as you were walking into this important place.
Yeah.
So he's really marking that transition into, uh, you know, essentially a sacred space, I guess, in terms of being associated with these early kings of Pictland. So you can really see how ideology and belief and power are really encapsulated through carvings like that. So very fascinating.
So interesting. And it's you say it's unique in Britain. I mean, it's unique in Europe as far as I'm aware. There's nowhere else where there's this level of the sheer number of stones. It's
Yeah.
astonishing. I would heartily recommend anyone who is coming to visit Britain, if you're an American out there, get up to Edinburgh, get up to Glasgow. There's a bunch of museums all over Scotland, and they're full of these stones.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just go and marvel at them. It
No,
just
no.
it interests me because it seems like it's a little bit of a pre-Christian thing that then survives into the Christian age. It becomes Christianized, a little bit like that happens with the Anglo-Saxons. It happens with the Vikings as well. But it's just uniquely Pictish, isn't it? It's completely different. They're not Scythians, though, are they?
No, so that's it's an origin myth that Bede puts forward for the kind of origins of the Picts. And it's probably because him and others are reading classical sources about tattooed, painted people, which is the origin of the name, the Picts. And they're putting two and two together and saying, well, the Scythians were tattooed and the Picts were as well, so they must be the same people. So it's just one of these kind of origin myths about early medieval societies and kingdoms that doesn't have much basis in fact. No, they seem to be local Iron Age groups that then transition. They probably centralized because of this Roman army on their doorstep in that Roman Iron Age context. And it's just a nickname. It just means the painted people. It's the barbarians living north of the frontier. But for whatever reason, that name sticks, and the post-Roman contemporaries, the Picts, call them this, and we presume the Picts also called themselves that, or a variation of that name, probably embracing that kind of anti-Roman identity. But again, it's something we're not certain of, as many things with the Picts. We're not entirely sure what they called themselves. Yeah.
Do you think there would have been Pictish chronicles that are just lost now?
I mean, it's very difficult to know. I mean, they're certainly producing books as the new archaeological evidence from Port Mahomet, a big
I was going
monastery
to ask you about Port Mahomet. Yeah.
in Pictland, suggests they're certainly producing books there. And Victoria Whitworth has recently suggested the Book of Kells was created there. So they're certainly writing things down. We know that from a few inscriptions here and there, Latin-based inscriptions. Ogham and other writing systems are being utilized by the Picts, probably the symbols themselves. So they're more than capable. But what happened to those written chronicles, if they existed, is hard to know, really. I mean, it's not impossible that we might find some hidden away in a library somewhere or in a bog somewhere at some point. But yeah, unfortunately, we have to work with what we have at the moment, which is mainly external sources other than the Pictish king lists. Um, But yeah, that's where archaeology comes into, and that's kind of really forces us to get into the field and um, dig up some more sites to try and illuminate the lives of the Picts. And that's, as an archaeologist, that's great fuel for me to go out and do some more work on these Pictish settlement sites and like.
Absolutely. So Burghead may have been destroyed by Vikings. I mean, I'm thinking some of the, if there were texts, they maybe wouldn't have survived the Viking age. If we go back a few hundred years, what happens to Tap and Noth?
Yeah, so that's interesting. It seems to come to an end round about 600 AD, and the site down the lowland Rhynie seems to come to an end maybe a generation or two before that. So it doesn't. There's no evidence of any kind of major catastrophe there, and we've done things like pollen records looking at environment through time. And there's no major obvious hiatus or kind of decline, huge decline in settlement we can see from the regional records. So it looks like settlement continued there, just maybe not quite maybe on that scale and kind of centralized nature as before. So I think it's more likely that something else happened. In terms of this polity was really important in this earlier Pictish period, and this is one of their centers. But other regions perhaps overtook them in terms of becoming the main center of these early kings. And we can see that from other examples across Britain and Ireland. Some royal centres have very brief, kind of sunburst moments in the sun, and then they disappear from records really. So it seems likely it's moving somewhere else. Maybe even Burghead. The actual start date for Burghead through a radiocarbon modelling maps fairly closely onto the
Quite
end.
similar, isn't it? Yeah,
It's
it's
quite
quite
similar, yeah.
convenient for you.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? In terms
Yeah.
of it is an obvious place where it might move, but there's also other sites like Mither Tap, which is at Benny,
Mm.
a big hill fort just to the east of Rhynie. So it looks to me more like it's kind of moving, not quite naturally, but kind of life cycle of these royal centres. It can be
Tell
relatively short, yeah.
tell us about Mither Tap.
So yeah, it's another really impressive hill fort. It's a huge landmark in northeast Scotland. Everyone knows about Benahee. Um, it's so visible across the Aberdeenshire countryside, and it's got this really really dramatic kind of granite towers, and on one of them is this really impressive hill fort called Mither Tap. And again, it was not one that has really been looked at other than some antiquarian investigations, which unfortunately I think quite damaged some of the deposits there. But again, it seems to be a site that's probably broadly contemporary with Burghead, so 7th, 8th, 9th century. There is the name of a lost Gallic saga which talks about the ravaging of Benahee. So that site does look like it's been destroyed at some point.
Mm.
Um, Maybe in the Viking Age, we're not quite sure. So again, it's one of these ones that has this tantalizing kind of literary reference to it, but other than that, we have to rely on the archaeology. So yeah, it's one we've done a bit of work on there, but it would be good to do some more for sure.
Not quite on the same scale as Burghead, is that right?
No, it's a
Yeah.
very relatively small site. It's quite impressive defenses, very impressive ramparts, but probably more of a kind of I don't know a smaller regional center than somewhere like Burghead, which seems to be just the a real central place in that 7th, 8th, 9th century context and receiving material from all over the place, and one of the largest enclosed settlements we know from that later Pictish time period. So yeah, it's definitely on a different scale and complexity, I would say. So the hill fort Tapanoth is impressive in terms of its size. In terms of its complexity, Burghead far outstrips anything else with these huge
Yeah.
8-meter wide ramparts, 6 meters high. This incredible timber lacing, the kind of timber framework to the ramparts there. Huge buildings inside. So yeah, again, I think we just landed our feet in terms of finding another site that really begins to illuminate just how complex some of these Pictish settlements were and how connected they were through the international trade to places like England and beyond in this Pictish time period.
Just to wildly hazard a guess, are these competing polities?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, obviously we have this kind of skeletal literary record that we have from things like Irish chronicles and from beads, histories, and the like. And so within those literary sources, we have references to the Picts fighting with their neighbours, with the Britons, the Scots, with Northumbrians and the like, but they're also fighting amongst themselves. So there's lots of references to, civil wars within Pictish regions, different Pictish kings coming a cropper from their followers. So yeah, it's a time period we can often romanticize, and it's fascinating to find about, but not one we probably want to actually live amongst and be part of that time period for any length of time. I think Leslie Alcock, one of the great kind of early examples of an early medieval archaeologist, he looked at some of the annal entries and he worked out that being a early medieval king was a really bad idea. I can't remember what the exact stat was, but something like 80% of them get killed by their own family, they killed in battle, and it's just a constant revolving door of these
Yeah,
leaders coming to the fore and then coming a cropper. And in most cases, some of them, were incredibly successful. Like Angus is a 8th century Pictish king who holds his own against the Northumbrians and takes over big parts of Dalriada, the Scottish areas in the west. So some of them are hugely successful, but others last for a couple of months. So yeah, I wouldn't gamble on being a Pictish king basically because like all other kings in Britain and Ireland in this time period, it can be quite precarious, I think, in terms of your longevity.
do you think would Angus have been bringing all of the other kingdoms together into an over kingdom?
Yeah, so it's not entirely clear if there's always one Pictish king in the kind of later time period, or are there multiple? There is, I think it's 8th century reference to a king of Athol, which is the kind of mountainous, kind of central region of Pictland in that time period. But that sub king gets drowned by, I think it is by Angus. I can't quite remember the details. Anyway, not a very good advertisement for the power and longevity of a sub king
Yeah,
in that
yeah,
time period. And then in Athavan's Life of Columba, they talk about a sub king of Orkney being in the court of Brethay, who's this really powerful king. And other references talk about such and such a king being a powerful king of Pictland. So this implies that there are others, but again, it's not clear whether there's always an overking from the late 7th century onwards, or whether there are times when there are competing kings and kingdoms within Pictland. It does seem that there is an overking for the majority of the time period after the Battle of Nectansmere in the late 7th century. But again, unless we find more written sources, that's probably going to be remain uncertain.
yeah, yeah. That's when Edgefrith, king of Northumbria, is kicked out of Pictland definitively. I mean, it's because the Northumbrians had claimed a little bit of southern Pictland, right? So it seems fair enough that the Picts would unite a bit more after that. I think it would make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in the way that society seems to be centralizing in face of Roman incursions in the earlier time periods. I think whenever you have, a new polity or a new threat on your doorstep, it does give you the opportunity to reorganize society in face of that threat. And probably the same thing's happening in the Viking Age when we get, disappearance of the Picts and you get the emergence of this new kingdom called Alba, which seems to incorporate parts of Dalriada and Pictland into one. That's probably a reaction to the Vikings and these new Scandinavian settlers taking over parts of Pictland and Dalriada, and the people who are there having to reorganize society basically to deal with these new threats. I think.
Yeah, I feel a bit sorry for the Picts in the 9th century because they sort of, on the face of it, get hemmed in from the west and the east, and they're sort of just trapped in the middle. And then they don't disappear, they do. They just become Scots.
Yeah, exactly. It's just again a kind of new name for this polity, and Alba's seems to be largely kind of southern Pictland, parts of northern Pictland. So yeah, the people would have been largely the same. It's just that changes at the top, and changes
Yes.
in branding, for want of a better
Yes,
term.
absolutely. Just before we get to the end, right, I want to just ask some questions about Fortriu. Is that how you say it?
You're probably closer than I am in terms of saying.
I've only ever read the word really, Fortria, but there's an idea that it's this preeminent kingdom. It used to be hypothesized in the south. Now it's seen as more likely in the north. Why do we think it's the preeminent kingdom? And also, why do we think it's in the north now? Or do we think that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's still debated to an extent, and again, it's maybe something we'll never fully quite pin down unless we get some new information. But this was the work by Alex Wolff a few years back, or God, almost about 20 years ago now. Um,
That'll
wrote,
be it. That's where I've read
yeah,
this.
Alex Wolff. And so, yeah, Fortree was always thought to be located in southern Pictland, associated with places like Forteviot and the like. But Alex noted that some of the information about this polity suggested it could be located further north in places like Murray and perhaps parts of Aberdeenshire, maybe further north as well. So he relocated this kingdom to the north. And I think that's generally accepted by most people working in this area today, but again, it is still a topic of debate. I think as an archaeologist, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I'm not sure how much I care. It's nice to be able to kind of label groups, and you're like, when I worked in prehistory, you could never, you didn't have any written sources to be able to say
No.
this group's here and that group there. So for me, I'm not sure how much it really matters. I think, what is important to me now is what can the archaeology tell us?
Yes.
Does it map onto our written sources, or does it maybe contradict some of those written sources? I think we can't doubt that places like Rhynie and Tap and Noth were a surprising element to the archaeology of northern or northeast Pictland, and Burghead is certainly a really important site in that 7th, 8th, 9th century. Whether we can associate with the kingdom of Fortru or not, it clearly was a huge centre. And can we identify any other sites like that across Pictland of that time period? I have to say, at the moment, we can't really. Some of the nuclear hill forts have some nice finds from fairly small scale excavation, but they certainly don't have the complexity of defences that Burghead has. And yeah, that would certainly map on to where Alex Wolff suggests Fortru is located. Um, but yeah, might change in the coming decades if
May well
people
do.
begin to rework those sources. And certainly, there are historians working on that subject now who might have a different opinion. So watch this space and find out more.
Yes. This other site you mentioned, Forteviot, that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because that's another royal centre of
Yep.
quite prominent.
So yeah, that one's associated with Kenneth MacAlpin. So 9th century Pictish king, very important one. And it's a kind of more lowland centre, so a kind of later lowland centre, different to what we found at Rhynie. So these central places, these royal centres, kind of change through time, and we don't again, still don't know enough about places like Fertiviat because the disadvantage of being a lowland centre is obviously that, you get the modern village of Fertiviat built over the top of all those remains there. So it's difficult to know exactly what it's referred to as a palace in that 9th century source. So what did a Pictish palace look like?
Mm.
And at the moment, we can't really tell you. And imagine it's probably got a really important church and it's got some nice sculpture, presumably, some sort of royal hall there. But again, that's where archaeology, hopefully in the future, can begin to fill in the gaps and tell us more about how royal centres began to develop in this kind of 8th, 9th century context away from kind of hill forts or promontory forts, which continued to be important places, but other types of sites began to emerge as well.
I think the evidence is skewed towards those defensive sites, isn't it? Because they're quite prominent and they survive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Things like Dunnicaer and
Yeah.
East Lomond Fort and places like that.
Mhm.
Really, really cool places. I'd recommend everybody to go visit them because they are great, and you'll often have the place to yourself. Where else should we be looking for the Picts? I mean, where would you like to be looking?
So the other major site we're working on at the moment is East Lomond, which is down the Fife, so southern Pictish centre. And that's really cool because it's got almost exactly the same sequence as Tapanoth and Rhynie. It emerges in the 3rd century and goes through to about 600 AD. So we've got a second site that maps onto that sequence. So it shows that Rhynie's not the only site. And East Lomond's kind of almost more exciting in some ways because it's got a really nice stratified sequence that, it's got deposits that are about half a meter thick. And within that sequence, you've got, houses and structures from about 200, 300 AD at the bottom. And then at the top, you've got buildings and structures from 600, 700 AD,
Wow.
when the Pictish overkingship is in place. So being able to stratigraphically excavate a sequence like that, which we could do a little bit at Tapa North, but maybe not quite to the same level at a second site, is hugely exciting in the southern Pictish territory instead. So how does it compare to that northern sequence? What does that say about how many major hill forts were there in this early Pictish period, and how many competing centres were there? What was the language of power? Was it the same at these sites as elsewhere? So that's one site we're working on. And then we've also been working a little bit in the Northern Isles, places like Shetland recently. And so we think, places like Shetland and Orkney prior to the Scandinavian takeover were part of Pictland. But again, it's not something we know an awful lot about. And when people have went to dig in Shetland and Orkney in the past, they've, looked for Vikings or they looked for the Stone Age and nothing really in between. So there's, very rarely been a dedicated project looking at the Picts of the Northern Isles, for example. So we're trying to change that by looking at places like Mail in Shetland, which has got a carving called the um, Koenigsborough figure or the mailman, and
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
he
Yeah.
looks like the Rhynie man, but
Mm.
he's a bit smaller. And the place name there, Koenigsborough, means the King's Fort in Old Norse, and it's like, well, this is really interesting. Again, do we have a similar sequence or similar deposits to Rhynie, or how does that differ? So, yeah, we're quite excited about our Northern Isles adventures as well.
Very interesting. I hadn't quite clocked that East Lomond had those early dates. That's super interesting. Is
Mhm.
this, a competing site to Tapanoth? Are these places of assembly? Is this where people would go seasonally for the festivals of the year?
Yeah, no, exactly. So in the Rhynie monograph, we explore that. Is Tapanoth a year-round settlement, which is possible, or is it a place of, kind of episodic assembly where people are gathering to give tribute to a king and then moving on? So yeah, we explore that dimension to the site. Yes, yeah, East Lomond has got a similar deposit, similar sequence. And again, similar questions, is this a year-round settlement, or again, is this people gathering at certain times of the year at these important assembly points within a kingdom? I don't think we've fully answered that yet, so I think, hopefully East Lomond can help us address that for sure.
Amazing. I just remembered I wanted to ask you just really quickly. Actually, this could get us nicely to the end. Did you do any work at Dunnicaer? Was that
Yes.
you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Let's briefly talk about that because that's a very early site, but it's also next to Dunnottar,
Daughter.
which is
Yeah.
quite a late site. So we could begin with Dunnicaer, then we'll end with Dunnottar.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we did some work at Dunnicaer as well, and that was again quite an early example for us in terms of our Northern Picts project. A lot of our work has been, there's some really interesting Pictish carved stones from this location, like the Rhynie Man came from this really important settlement that we helped uncover. So Dunnicaer, there's this very strange kind of sea stack just to the north of Dunnottar, which is mentioned in some of our chronicle sources as being under siege and clearly an important hill fort or coastal promontory fort in the Pictish period. So, but Dunnicaer is just to the north in the next bay, and about was it 5 or 6 symbol stones came from the site, and they're quite odd symbol stones in terms of they're really rough and ready. They're quite, I don't know, poorly carved, or want of a better expression. And so people were like, "Well, these are a bit poor quality, or maybe they're early examples." And so anyway, we went to the sea stack to find out, what on earth, why might they have came from the sea stack, what was on there. So we had to like hire a professional climber to get us up there. Terrified of heights, so that was quite a big challenge.
Did you
uh,
have to do like a zip wire over to the
we had
sea
to zip
stack?
wire across because
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
well, not zip wire across, but we had to like get across because it's tidal. So you had to get onto the stack, and then you had to rope up to get up on top,
Lift it up.
lift us up, basically. So yeah, we excavated there, and again, to cut a long story short, it's a promontory fort, or was a promontory fort, but really, really badly treated by coastal erosion, which must have removed, a huge proportion of the site. But again, like within a couple of hours of test pitting, we came down on Pictish floor levels, hearths, part of the rampart, and it was the rampart that the records suggest the stones came from, so built into the wall surrounding this fortified settlement. And the beauty of that was we were able to date all the floor deposits, the hearths, and the rampart. Obviously, we can't date the stones themselves.
Mm.
But all the dates we got from Dunnicaer were 2nd to 4th century AD, so in that Roman Iron Age time period in
It's
which
so early.
and really early, and it suggests the stones are probably again early examples, and from that kind of Roman Iron Age time period. So it was a really, really important site in the beginning to establish the chronology for the symbol system and understand more about the context of some of these enigmatic symbol carved monuments. So it
Are
was
they the earliest stones found anywhere?
well, I mean, certainly in terms of contextual dating, yeah. So it would suggest that those examples were, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century in date. So yeah, it certainly suggests that they are started to be carved in that Roman Iron Age context, which makes a lot of sense in terms of, the Picts being aware of literate cultures, but doing their own thing, and they're creating this non-Latin based system of probably a naming system. Again, to cut a very long story short.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But in terms of the actual secure dates, we have bone objects from the Northern Isles, which are dated the 5th and 6th centuries AD. So that's probably more secure dates. But certainly the contextual evidence would suggest that it's probably a bit earlier as well in terms of the origins of that system.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, so
It
it's,
would
I,
make sense if it's contemporary with runes and Ogham and things like that, wouldn't it?
yeah,
The
it
other
does.
scripts on
Again,
the
we've
borders of the Roman Empire.
absolutely, but again, we've kind of often assumed that the Picts were maybe a bit late to the party and the like, but, all the evidence from Rhynie and the like now shows that they were, innovators in creating these
Mm.
centralized
Yeah,
settlements and
yeah,
that
yeah,
like, and
yeah,
probably earlier than what's happening elsewhere because,
yeah, and
this
bigger.
and bigger. Yeah, well, you've got this military zone at the northern frontier, and where else might you begin to get the origins of this kind of warrior kingship? It's
Yeah, yeah,
at the
yeah.
northern frontier makes an awful lot of sense. So rather than being backwards and late to the show, the Picts and their contemporaries in that part of the world may have been the forefront of creating this new form of society in this post-Roman, late and post-Roman context.
Gordon, I'm saying it. There's the problem of the Picts. It hasn't been solved, but we're certainly moving towards solving it. I mean, this is not a mysterious people at all, is it? This is a people who existed in the context of the late Roman Empire. And,
Yeah. Yeah.
These are some of the most astonishing places anywhere in Britain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think there have been a lot of ink spilt about, were the Picts of the 7th, 8th centuries, different or the same to those in the late Roman sources. And yeah, sure, they're different in terms of, there's many centuries separating them. But what we can see now is that places like Rhynie and now East Lomond, you've certainly got the origins of a new form of society at the northern frontier rooted in that late Roman context, in which the Romans come up with this new name to describe this people living north of the frontier. So I think they're recognizing things are changing in the northern frontier, and now archaeology is beginning to back that up, I think.
Yes. And what happens at the end? Should we move to the next bay along? Should we go to Dunnottar?
Dunnottar, oh yeah, yeah. Dunnottar is this coastal, much bigger sea stack promontory fort type arrangement there. So what happens across Pictland is you definitely have interventions, shall we say, to put it politely, from Viking society.
Oh, they'd call it intervention, wouldn't they?
Yeah, something our politicians would say.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, there's all sorts of wars and battles happening between these new Scandinavian settlers and Pictish society, particularly coming from the Danelaw. So there's references to some of the Danelaw leaders coming north and harrying Pictland in the 860s and 870s, wasting, parts of Pictland up into Atholl, where places like Cluny and Dunkeld, killing Pictish kings, lots of Pictish warriors killed in battle. So undoubtedly having a big effect. And also possibly beginning to take over parts of what were northern Pictland, so the Northern Isles and the Western Isles and the like. And equally, having a big impact on like Kingdom Dalriata and other regions. And the same happens in England. The Scandinavian settlers and their followers take over and destroy various English kingdoms of this time period. And again, you get centralization and Alfred rising and Wessex rising to fill that gap. So similar things seem to happen in Pictland in terms of you get a merging of the Scots and the Picts to create this new kingdom of Alba. And probably, most of society largely continuing as is, but certainly there seems to be some change at the top, and the kings of Alba begin to trace their roots back to a kind of Gallic west and this kingdom of Dalriata to the west there, but still recognizing their Pictish roots to an extent as well. So yeah, you seem to have big social changes happening around about 900 AD, and largely the disappearance of Picts as an identity, but also the death of or disappearance of Pictish as a language, which we think was a Brittonic form of speaking. Gaelic becomes the language of the court in this new kingdom. So there's a lot of changes, I think, happening there that contribute to this transition in society, and maybe that's at the root of perhaps losing some written records relating to the Picts in terms of loss of a language. and the like through time. So yeah, that's certainly a time period we'd like to know a lot more about as well in terms of, is there a dark age of northern Britain now? It's probably that kind of 10th, 11th century, and what happens at the end of the Pictish period is probably one area that we really need to know more. And I think that's where Burghead will come in terms of really providing a great sequence at the time of that transition.
But I suppose it's worth saying Kenneth MacAlpine was king of the Picts, and then he is also king of the Scots, or his descendants become king of the Scots.
His descendants are, but yeah, he is noted in the contemporary sources as being king of the Picts. But in later history, he was often seen as being the guy who destroyed the Picts, but he's not
Right.
actually referred to as a Pictish ruler. But
Yeah.
what happens there is his lineage become the ones associated with the kingdom of Alba. So that's where that kind of
Mm.
idea of Ken MacAlpin being a really important king in terms of change of lineage and change of social political identity comes from. But yeah, it seems to be a slower transition than that. So it's some of his descendants that probably are leading to this change in, again, branding, naming, language, political outlook, and the like. So yeah, really fascinating time period. And again, that's something hopefully that archaeology can contribute more to in terms of showing how some of these places change. And it's certainly interesting that Burghead is this huge northern center, seems to go out of use sometime around about 900 AD. And, you know, these regions like Murray become quite contested zones
Mm.
period of Alba. So again, what's happening there? And that's presumably why Pictland as an entity is no longer tenable, or one of the reasons why it's no longer tenable is because some of the big centres like Burghead are being destroyed and abandoned in that time period.
Interesting. It's interesting. Then later on, the Mormares of Murray
Hmm.
rise, and they're an independent force.
Yep,
So we have this
absolutely.
idea of Scotland being sort of a unified thing, but it wasn't always.
Oh,
Various different.
no,
Yeah.
absolutely not. No, I mean, in the early medieval period, you got, what, 4 or 5 different kingdoms, different language groups. It's a real mixing pot of different identities and different polities. And even with
Mm.
polities, you've got different competing forces and civil wars and the like. Yeah, Scotland, in terms of its territorial extent, it's not till, quite late on that becomes what we think of it as today. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Very last question. That
Mhm.
coin of Alfred in Burghead, was that in the pocket of a Viking who sacked the place?
Yes, well, that's ongoing research, I guess, in
Yeah.
terms of like
Or, could have been traded, I suppose,
what's
is
the
the other
context.
option.
We actually have 3 Alfred coins now
Oh, right.
from Burkhead. There was one found in 19th century. We found a fragment of one um, a couple of years back, and then a complete coin from the floor of a structure. But we've also got other bits and pieces of Anglo-Saxon material culture from Burghead. So there's something very intriguing going on there in terms
Hmm.
of the material
Some
you.
sort of last alliance going on.
Well, yes. Is it actually Vikings sacking Burghead, or is it people who are living within that fort who are encountering uh, Viking raiders in battle? Are they acting as mercenaries within, society, and the material comes via that way? So there's lots of different routes as to why that material might end up in Burghead. Whatever the scenario, I think it certainly looks like, enemies of some kind
Mm.
then began to look at Burghead and think, oh, hold on a minute, there's something we need to do about this. And
This
yeah,
looks pretty good. Yeah.
it looks pretty good. Or, it's something that's really, not working in terms of this wider Pictish kingdom. There's something happening here, so and it gets destroyed for whatever reason. So, yeah, I think that's what we're trying to piece together at the moment. And the more radiocarbon dates we get, the more we can begin to model when exactly the fort goes out of use, and is it actually destroyed in that time period, or is it a slower kind of abandonment of the site over a few generations? So I think watch the space in terms of how we interpret that. So
Fascinating. I assume this your papers will be on academia and things like that for
yeah,
people
just
to
check out
look at.
my University of Aberdeen website for our latest publications. There's bits and pieces about Burghead in the Scourge of Rome book, but yeah, this will be our next work of the next few years. Is available in all good and some bad
Yep.
bookshop. Um,
It's a very good
and
book, that one.
yeah, we
Very good.
haven't published a huge amount of Burghead yet, but that'll be over the next few years. We'll begin to get more out about the site.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for talking to us, Gordon. Everybody go check out his research. And yeah, that's all from us.